Alright, let's chat about interface design, specifically about form design. Look, I apologize to my 7 regular viewers who are expecting some Counter-Strike footage, but I thought I would try something a little bit different today. Chances are that if you are a UI, UX or product designer that you have run into your fair share of forms. And if you haven't, then chances are that you will. So first up, there are probably 2 main success metrics that we look for when we are building a form. The first one being speed, so how quickly a user can complete the form. And the second one being accuracy, so how many mistakes they make or how little mistakes they make in the form. And there's another one, a third one, which would be probably conversion, so how likely it is that the user would complete the form. But I won't focus too deeply on that one today, so I apologize in advance. Alright, so first things first, our form needs a field. So we'll go ahead and add one. I will just edit this quickly over in the inspector. So we'll make it 250 wide, 35 high, and we'll give it a 4 radius. We'll make it white on the inside, and there we go. We have our first field. Now the fields themselves can actually communicate with the user. Their size, for example, can suggest or let the user know how much information is expected to go into them. And this is known as affordance. So affordance is the suggestion of an action on an object. Now that sounds technical, but all it means is that if the field is longer, then the user should be expected to put more information into that. If we compare, say, this field with, we'll make this one short, this field, you kind of see what I mean. And if we compare both of those fields to something like this, then it really starts to become apparent. Now, let's get rid of those 2 and we will work with 3 fields today. Now, our fields need labels, right? And where should the labels go? There are 3 common places. There's above the field, there is to the left of the field. So we'll chuck these ones over here to the left. Yeah, that's good enough for now. And we'll tidy this up. Cool. And then there is also to the left of the field, but right aligned. So they're nice and snug up next to that right-hand edge. Now Luke W., who is let's say a UX researcher, has actually done a lot of studies around which placement is the best. And the short of it is there is no best placement. They each have their own strengths and their own weaknesses. These ones with the labels above the fields are great for speed and accuracy, but they use up a lot of vertical space, so the longer your form gets, well, the longer it gets. And it's not very easy to quickly scan through these labels and find specific fields that you're looking for. Compare above the field with, say, this one down the bottom right here, which is also extremely common. And they have very similar completion times and accuracy, but the scannability on these ones is really lacking. This ragged left-hand edge here makes it very difficult for the user to actually quickly scan through and find a specific field. You also have an issue where really long field names start to really push that label across, so you end up with something, yeah, you see what I mean. Now this final example actually has the slowest completion times because the user's eyes are constantly jumping from the label on the left over to the input field on the right. But they have the fastest scannability. So if users are looking for a particular field in a big long list, then this is your go-to solution. Now, while this placement has the slowest completion times, you can actually use that to your advantage. So think about forms where you would consciously want your users to slow down and think about what they're putting into the field. And this would be useful for examples like credit card information or banking details, where accuracy is so much more important than speed. Let's just run with the above the field example for now, and we'll move right along. Now, fields are great for capturing most data, but sometimes you need specific information back from the user. And you could use radio buttons, checkboxes, or drop-down lists to get these really specific answers. Now, radio buttons, checkboxes, and drop-down lists, they all seem pretty similar on the surface, but they each have different dynamics, and thus they elicit a different response from our users. So we'll use 3 examples here. First off, if we want to capture someone's gender, for example, it's probably best to assume that a radio button is the way to do this, and I'll show you why. Great, so that's a pretty common use for a radio button, and you can see that the user would be able to select one of those, and they can clearly see all three options that are available to them. Now, radio button placement is also a controversial subject. So whether you would place the radio buttons down a vertical list like this, or whether you would actually chuck them like this. I've talked to quite a few UX designers about which placement they prefer or what they think would be best. And the answers are, let's just say, all over the show, between horizontal and vertical. There has been studies which show that the further along the list and the further right that an option is, the much higher the chances that a user will not see that option. Cool, so we're capturing gender. If we wanted to capture, say, extra ingredients that someone wanted on their burger. Now, you couldn't use a radio button, assuming that they want more or potentially want more than one extra ingredient. There you would instead want to use a checkbox. So let's go ahead and change these. We'll get rid of them and we'll put little squares here. And we'll go ahead and chuck some of those down. Cool. So now we'll write extra ingredients. And we'll chuck some extra ingredients here. So here you can clearly see that if we make them white, so again, they don't look disabled, then you can see that this is when you would use checkboxes because it allows the users to see all of the options available and select multiple options. You could use a single checkbox as a toggle to say yes or no, or on or off. You could use this for something like terms of service. And off would suggest that they don't agree, and on would suggest that they do. Now lastly, we actually have dropdowns. Dropdowns are very similar to radio buttons where they allow the user to only select one option, but they actually hide all of those options. So let's say we did have gender here. Now that could work, but the problem you have there is that users can't actually see what's underneath, and also it takes them an extra click to actually first show the options and then select one. Whereas up here, it's just simply a click. Now that may not be too much of an issue for this form, but it does slow down completion times, and the more you have, the slower the user is. Where would you use a dropdown? Now I've heard a lot of talk in the UX community that dropdowns are useless or should be avoided at all costs, and yes, I kind of agree. But there are cases where dropdowns can be used well. So let's look at, say, country. Now if we had please select your country, and then we had all countries in the world, that list is going to be huge. Probably not the best use for a drop-down, right? But a drop-down can be useful for between kind of 5 and 15 items, is kind of the general rule of thumb. Now you'd want to use radio buttons if you're dealing with 5 or less options, but as soon as you go over 5, then it starts to become quite complicated and makes your form longer, and also puts cognitive strain on your user because there's just so much more information being shown. That's when you would start to consider using a drop-down, where you have kind of between 5 and 15 options. If you're going over 15 options, then you want to look at some kind of dynamic filtering. Type your country here and it starts kind of filtering through all the countries and shows you the results. Now you could use drop-down in this example for, say, their drink, because chances are that you would have maybe more than 5 options for a drink and less than 15, say. So drink could be a good option to use a drop-down. Great, so now that we have fields with correct affordances and we have radio buttons, checkboxes and drop-downs being used correctly, we can kind of start to see our form take shape. But there's one critical component missing, and that's buttons. Now every form needs 2 basic buttons, a primary button and a secondary button. One to submit the form and one to cancel or go away from it. Now there's a lot that you can actually do with buttons, their style, their color, their size, their shape, their placement, etc. And I'm not going to go through all of that, but there is one rule that you should follow, and that is that your primary button should look like a primary button, and your secondary button should look like a secondary button. So I'll give you a really quick example. Let's add a button here. The reason I said place order not submit is because ambiguous button labels are a pet peeve of mine. And you can start to see what I mean. One is green, which is emphasized and it's positive and it has positive connotations with it. The other is more subdued and less emphasized, which would suggest that it is less important, which in this case it would be. But again, there are always exceptions to this rule. What if you, say, wanted your users to slow down and really consider the form before submitting it? Well, then you would probably make both of your buttons the same or very similar. And this would cause your users to likely run through the form and then go, which button do I press? And they would have to read the labels and make their choice. With our example, a green button communicates this a lot quicker and a lot more effectively, and it's not as important for our user to stop and think about their decision, so you would probably go with emphasizing the primary action. Alright, that's enough for today, people. I really hope you learned something. Let me know if you have any follow-up questions or comments in the comment section below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for new videos every week. Thanks, and I will see you guys next time.